Hello and welcome to this video on the use of mould in cheese. Most people would recognize that cheese is a white to yellow semi-solid mass. Of course, not all cheese is like this. A simple but very explicit example is blue cheese. That is a cheese that has made use of fungi that grows in the cheese to create a very unique flavour and appearance. The blue mould is a group of different fungi that are collectively described as a mould. These moulds do not metabolize cheese in the same way the bacteria do. This is why the cheese does not rot, but instead considered to have a better flavour. This is similar in some ways to kimchi, miso, surströmming, and more. There is no single blue cheese, as it is a very broad designation for those cheeses made in many parts of Europe. The general process of making blue cheese is comparatively straightforward. That is, to create a blue cheese, you begin with a normal cheese recipe that uses full cream milk. It has both high fat and high protein content. You use both a bacterial culture and a mould culture at this point. However, this is not pressed as much for something like, say, cheddar cheese, which is generally much denser. The next step is to poke holes all the way through the cheese. This is not only where the mould is inoculated to some extent, as it will pass up through those holes and down through them. It's also to allow air to travel all the way through the cheese. The combination of both air and pathways for the mould to travel allow it to more quickly grow than the slow growth without. Most cheeses that we're talking about, as far as blue cheese is concerned, use some sort of penicillin species, generally speaking Penicillium roqueforti, and this is used to reliably create the same effect. It can also be added over the top of the cheese, or it can be used solely as part of the inoculation of bacteria and fungi. Whether you add it towards the aging stage or during the process of turning milk into curds, the cheese still needs another 60 to 90 days for the mycelium to spread out, the mycelium being those blue veins. The mycelium is part of what is going to be creating the flavour that you're after. However, it also has a second effect. When we mention that you don't press the cheese as much, that's not entirely necessary, as the mycelium also happens to break down a lot of the content within the cheese, and this softens it a lot. The process of breaking it down and mycelium itself creates both a colour and flavour unique to blue mould. The mould itself, although we call it a blue mould, is a close relative of the penicillin species used for antibiotics. But to be clear, one is by no means a substitute for the other. They are distinctly different. The mould, as seen in cheese, is, well, to be quite blunt, there primarily just to break down the contents of the cheese, largely speaking about the protein and sugar content of it, which is the lactose and the proteins of milk. It is worth noting that white mould used for some different cheeses is also a relative of the penicillin used for antibiotics, but there is an incredibly large family at more than 600 strains that are out there. For the most part, all of these different moulds have a very similar way of functioning. That is, the penicillin itself will release enzymes. The enzymes primarily start with something like a lactase. The lactase breaks down lactose into lactic acid. This is what increases the pH of the cheese, and this contributes somewhat to the change in texture, but also gives some of that bitter flavour that you'll be familiar with. The mould also has proteases. Proteases are what break down proteins, and again, this is what contributes to that texture as well as flavour. One of the reasons why you get a, let's say, umami-like flavour with these cheeses is largely that the breakdown of the sugars, which will be done through the mould and the other bacteria within the cheese, and the breakdown of proteins creates the same sort of product as MSG, although not exactly the same, but similar. The final product that's generated in large and noteworthy quantities by the blue mould in particular are lipolytics, or enzymes that break down lipids. Lipids being the general category for anything that's a fat. Milk being full of fat, protein, and water, along with some sugars. As you break down the lipids within the cheese, you release free fatty acids, otherwise known as ketones. And these are responsible for some of the fruity flavour that's unique to blue cheese. Unlike a lot of other possible additions, penicillium is a very active species. That is, it is very active in both breaking down protein and lipids. This means you get a lot of texture change, a lot of aroma change, and a lot of flavour change. Both the proteases and lipases are responsible for that texture change, as they are structurally altering the molecules, or in some cases breaking them down entirely. In terms of taste, there are a lot of molecules being made, for example, ammonia-like products or the ketones we mentioned earlier. The other noteworthy element of this is that penicillium does have something in common with yeast, and that commonality is the penicillium itself uses the cheese as a carbon source, the same way that yeast uses sugars to ferment. Both rely on it as a carbon source in order to be able to make necessary parts of the cell, whether that is the mould cell or bacterial cell or fungi overall in case of yeast. The breakdown is what we're looking for though, and that breakdown is there because it needs the cheese to be able to feed itself, for lack of a better phrase. The other element to it, and this is one reason why, strictly speaking, you don't need to put skewers all the way through blue cheese, but you could wait much longer for the same result, is that it doesn't necessarily require oxygen, but it performs much better with it. The other caveat to that is that if you leave it to grow without oxygen, it actually produces much stronger flavours, and these can be considered, well, to be quite blunt, offensive. While some may appreciate its unique flavour, the general market won't, and this is why mass-manufactured blue cheeses are doing the same thing video games are by going for the mythical wider market or wider audience. They're trying to create the most bland and inoffensive cheese that is just a tint of personality added to it, but not so much that you can really do much with it. This is, however, what makes the mould and blue cheese special. They can only dull that strong flavour, taste and aroma so much. It's not just that it's a mould, but it's the mould that uses the cheese to create extra and complex flavours. Unfortunately, flavours that can't be blunted as much. There are other cheeses, such as brie or camembert and similar, that aren't as strong in what they generate, and this is because the penetration of the mould is not as extensive. Blue mould used in cheese like this is that exception, and that is why you have a very, very interesting flavour. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions or suggestions below.